Judge Thomas Mitchell adjusted his black robes as he settled into his leather chair behind the wooden bench. The morning light filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor of the Millbrook Courthouse. At 52 years old, Thomas had spent nearly 2 decades in this same courtroom, building a reputation as a judge who was both fair and firm with those who appeared before him. The courthouse was quiet except for the soft shuffling of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. Thomas looked down at his docket for the day, a familiar routine that had become as natural as breathing. Traffic violations, minor disputes, and small claims cases filled his schedule. It was the kind of work that kept a small town running smoothly, though sometimes Thomas felt like he was going through the motions. Traffic violation, case number 4721, Thomas announced, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. The bailiff, a kind older man named Henry who had worked in the courthouse for 30 years, nodded and gestured toward the defendant's table. A young black woman stepped forward from the gallery, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. She wore a simple but well-tailored navy blue business suit that spoke of professionalism and respect for the court. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried a small briefcase in one hand and a folder of documents in the other. Despite the formal setting, she moved with a quiet confidence that suggested she was no stranger to legal proceedings. Grace Walker had been driving to visit her sick grandmother when she received the speeding ticket. The elderly woman lived in a nursing home on the other side of town, and Grace tried to visit her every week after work. On this particular evening, she had been running late due to a difficult case at her office. When she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, Grace's heart had sunk. She knew she had been careful about her speed, especially on that familiar stretch of road. "Your Honor," Grace began, her voice steady and respectful, "I was not speeding on the evening in question. I have brought evidence to support my case." She opened her folder and pulled out several photographs and documents. These pictures show that the speed limit sign was completely blocked by overgrown tree branches. The sign was not visible to drivers coming from my direction. Grace approached the bench with measured steps, holding out the photographs for the judge to examine. The pictures clearly showed thick branches covering the crucial speed limit posting. She had taken them the very next day, knowing that documentation would be important for her case. "I also have a witness statement from Mrs. Eleanor Davies, who was driving behind me that evening," Grace continued, producing a notarized document. "She can confirm that I was driving at a safe and legal speed, well within the posted limits for that area." Thomas glanced briefly at the photographs Grace had placed before him, but his attention seemed elsewhere. He had heard similar stories countless times before, and his expression remained skeptical. The afternoon was growing long, and he still had several more cases to review before the day was over. "I have also researched the maintenance records for that particular stretch of road," Grace added, pulling out additional papers. "The city's own records show that the tree trimming in that area was overdue by several months. This created a safety hazard for drivers who could not see the proper speed limit signs." Grace's preparation was thorough and professional. She had spent hours gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and researching municipal records. Her background as an attorney had taught her the importance of building a strong case. Even for something as simple as a traffic violation, she believed in the principle that everyone deserved a fair hearing, regardless of how minor their case might seem. But Judge Mitchell barely looked at the carefully prepared documents. His eyes seemed tired, and he rubbed his temples as if fighting off a headache. The stack of cases on his desk seemed to grow rather than shrink, and he found himself thinking about the problems waiting for him at home. "Miss Walker," Thomas said, with a weary sigh, "I appreciate your preparation, But I have to tell you that everyone who comes before me claims they weren't speeding. I've heard every excuse and seen every type of evidence. He pushed the photographs back across the bench toward her without really examining them. I'm imposing the full fine of $300 plus court costs. You can pay at the clerk's office. Grace's shoulders sagged slightly at the dismissal, but she maintained her composure and dignity. Years of facing similar situations had taught her to remain professional even when disappointed. She quietly gathered her papers and photographs, placing them back in her folder with careful precision. "Thank you, Your Honor," Grace said softly, her voice carrying no trace of anger or resentment. She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the now quiet courtroom. As she reached the bailiff's desk near the door, Grace paused and leaned toward Henry, speaking in a whisper so quiet that only he could hear. "Please tell Judge Mitchell that I hope his family situation gets better soon," she said, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "I've been praying for them." Henry looked puzzled by the unexpected message, but before he could ask any questions, Grace was already walking through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. Judge Mitchell continued with his remaining cases, unaware that his life was about to change forever. "Sometimes the people we dismiss hold the very keys to our salvation." The phone rang at exactly 7:32 in the evening, cutting through the quiet of the Mitchell family dinner. Thomas had just finished his meal and was reading the newspaper in his favorite armchair when the shrill sound made him look up with annoyance. Margaret was clearing the dishes from the table, humming softly to herself as she worked. "I'll get it," Thomas called out, setting down his paper and walking toward the kitchen where the old rotary phone hung on the wall. He expected it to be a telemarketer or perhaps his mother calling to chat about her garden. Instead, a serious voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from Millbrook General Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter Emma. She's been in a car accident." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. His hand gripped the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "What happened? Is she okay?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's alive, but her condition is serious. You need to come to the hospital immediately." Margaret noticed her husband's face had gone pale as he hung up the phone. "Thomas, what's wrong?" she asked, dropping the dish towel she had been holding. "Emma's been in an accident," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to go to the hospital right now." The drive to Millbrook General Hospital felt like the longest 15 minutes of their lives. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Thomas drove through the quiet streets of their small town. Neither of them spoke, but both were thinking the same terrible thoughts that all parents fear. When they arrived at the hospital, the fluorescent lights seemed too bright and the antiseptic smell was overwhelming, and nurse led them through a maze of corridors to the intensive care unit, where their 17-year-old daughter lay surrounded by machines and tubes. Emma looked so small and fragile in the hospital bed. Her usually vibrant face was pale and still, and the steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Bandages covered parts of her head and arms, and her leg was elevated in a cast. Dr. Chen explained that Emma had been hit by a drunk driver while walking to her friend's house. The impact had caused a serious head injury, a broken leg, and internal bleeding. "The good news is that she's stable now," the doctor said gently, "but she'll need several surgeries over the next few months, and the recovery process will be long and challenging." Margaret sank into the chair beside Emma's bed, tears streaming down her face. She reached out to touch her daughter's hand, being careful not to disturb the 4 tubes. "My baby," she whispered. "My poor baby." Thomas stood at the foot of the bed, feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his life. As a judge, he was used to having control and making decisions that affected people's lives. But here, watching his daughter fight for recovery, he realized there was nothing he could do to fix this situation. "Thomas," Margaret said through her tears, "I don't know how we're going to handle all of this. The insurance company called an hour ago. They're already saying that some of Emma's treatments might not be covered. They're calling it experimental therapy." Judge Mitchell felt his heart sink even further. He knew the law well, but medical insurance and patient rights were not his area of expertise. Criminal law, traffic violations, and small claims cases were what he dealt with every day. Healthcare law was a completely different field that required specialized knowledge. "They want to transfer to a different hospital," Margaret continued, "one that costs less money. But Dr. Chen says Emma needs to stay here where the specialists are. I don't know what to do." Thomas ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They needed legal help, and they needed it quickly. Emma's future depended on getting the right medical care, and the insurance company seemed determined to deny them that care. "I've been making phone calls all day," Margaret said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "I called every lawyer in town. Most of them are too busy or don't handle these types of cases. Medical malpractice and insurance law are very specialized fields." Thomas nodded, knowing she was right. They lived in a small town where most attorneys handled basic legal matters like wills, divorces, and property disputes. Finding someone who understood the complex world of medical insurance law would be difficult. "But there's one attorney who said she would come tonight. Even though it's so late," Margaret continued, "she specializes in healthcare law and patient rights. Her name is Grace Walker." Judge Mitchell felt his stomach drop as if he had been punched. Grace Walker, the same woman he had dismissed so coldly in his courtroom just that morning. He remembered her respectful manner, her careful preparation, and how he had barely glanced at her evidence before imposing the full fine. "Are you sure about the name?" he asked weakly, hoping he had misheard. "Yes, why?" Margaret looked at him with confusion. "Do you know her?" Before Thomas could answer, a gentle knock came at the hospital room door. Grace Walker stepped in, carrying a professional briefcase and wearing the same kind, determined expression she had shown in court. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," she said softly, "I'm Grace Walker. I'm here to help." Grace entered the hospital room with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked through many difficult situations before. Ray, her footsteps were soft on the polished floor, and she carried herself with a calm presence that seemed to bring peace to the tense atmosphere. If she recognized Judge Mitchell from their morning encounter in the courthouse, she gave no sign of it. Her entire focus was on the family's crisis and the young woman lying unconscious in the hospital bed. "I'm so sorry about Emma," Grace said warmly to Margaret, her voice filled with genuine concern. She set down her briefcase and approached the bed where the 17-year-old girl lay surrounded by me. "Medical equipment. I know this must be incredibly frightening for you both." Margaret looked up at Grace with red, swollen eyes. She had been crying for hours, and her face showed the exhaustion that comes from emotional shock. "Thank you for coming so late," she whispered. "I didn't know who else to call." Judge Mitchell stood in the corner of the room, watching this woman who had appeared in his courtroom just that morning. He felt a strange mixture of curiosity and embarrassment as he observed her professional manner. Grace moved round the room with purpose, but she was also gentle and respectful of the family's grief. Grace pulled out a chair beside Emma's bed and opened her briefcase with practiced efficiency. Inside were legal pads, folders, a laptop computer, and several thick books about medical law. She had clearly come prepared for a long night of work. "First, let's talk about your insurance situation," Grace said, taking out a yellow legal pad and a pen. "I need to understand exactly what the insurance company told you and what treatments they're questioning." Margaret began to explain the phone calls she had received from the insurance company. They had told her that Emma's treatment plan was too expensive and that some of the recommended therapies were not covered under their policy. The insurance representatives had used confusing medical terms and legal language that made it difficult for Margaret to understand what was happening. Grace listened carefully, taking detailed notes and asking specific questions. She wanted to understand every aspect of the situation before she began working on a solution. Judge Mitchell watched as she demonstrated a level of attention and care that impressed him deeply. "Can you show me Emma's medical records?" Grace asked. "I need to see exactly what the doctors are recommending." Dr. Chen had left copies of Emma's charts with the family, and Margaret handed them to Grace. For the next hour, Grace carefully reviewed every page of the medical records, insurance policies, and the hospital's treatment plan. She read through complex medical terminology and insurance language with the skill of someone who had spent years studying healthcare law. While she worked, Grace made several phone calls to insurance representatives. Even though it was late at night, she was able to reach people who could give her information about Emma's case. She spoke with authority and knowledge, using legal terms that clearly impressed the people on the other end of the phone. Judge Mitchell found himself studying Grace's face as she worked. Her brow was furrowed with concentration, and she occasionally made notes in the margins of documents. She was brilliant, compassionate, and completely devoted to helping his family. This was the same woman whose traffic case he had dismissed without proper consideration just hours earlier. Grace also spoke with Dr. Chen and other medical staff members. She asked detailed questions about Emma's condition, the recommended treatments, and the timeline for recovery. She wanted to understand not just the legal aspects of the case, but also the medical realities that Emma would face. The insurance company is trying to classify Emma's rehabilitation as experimental, Grace explained to the family after finishing her research. "But I know the law, and this treatment is absolutely covered under your policy. They're using scare tactics too. Try to avoid paying for expensive care." She showed them specific sections of their insurance policy that guaranteed coverage for the treatments Emma needed. Grace had highlighted the relevant passages and could explain them in simple terms that the family could understand. "I'm going to fight this," Grace said firmly. "Emma deserves the best possible care, and your insurance company is legally required to provide it." Margaret began to cry again, but this time her tears were tears of relief. For the first time since the accident, she felt like someone was truly on their side. "Grace," she said, "I have to ask, why are you doing this? Why did you come so late at night to help people you don't even know?" Grace looked up from her papers with a gentle smile that transformed her entire face. Her eyes were warm and kind, and Judge Mitchell could see the deep compassion that motivated her work. Because everyone deserves someone in their corner when they're facing the hardest moments of their lives, Grace said simply. "That's what the law is supposed to be about. Protecting people when they need it most." She gestured toward Emma's still form in the hospital bed. "This young woman has her whole life ahead of her. She shouldn't have to worry about whether she can get the medical care she needs because of insurance company paperwork." Judge Mitchell felt a deep shame wash over him as he listened to Grace's words. He was beginning to understand that he had failed to see Grace's true worth when she appeared in his courtroom. She was not just another defendant trying to avoid a traffic fine. She was a dedicated attorney who spent her time helping families in crisis, someone who truly understood what justice meant. Over the following weeks, as Emma slowly began her long journey toward recovery. Grace became like a guardian angel to the Mitchell family. Every morning at 7 o'clock, she would arrive at the hospital with fresh coffee and a warm smile. She would check on Emma's progress, speak with the doctors about her treatment plan, and review any new insurance paperwork that had arrived overnight. Grace's presence brought comfort to the entire family. Margaret began to look forward to her daily visits, knowing that Grace would have answers to her questions and solutions to problems that seemed impossible to solve. Thomas watched from a distance, amazed by Grace's dedication and professionalism. Emma's recovery was slow and difficult. The young woman had suffered serious injuries in the accident, and her body needed time to heal. Some days were better than others, and there were moments when the family wondered if she would ever be the same vibrant girl she had been before the accident. Through it all, Grace remained a constant source of support. She fought tirelessly with the insurance company, making phone calls and writing letters to ensure that Emma received every treatment she needed. When the insurance representatives tried to deny coverage for a physical therapy, Grace threatened to take them to court. When they questioned the need for a specialized equipment, Grace provided medical evidence that proved its necessity. Grace never sent a bill for her services. She never asked for recognition or praise. She simply showed up, day after day, with the same quiet determination and kindness that had brought her to the hospital that first terrible night. Her briefcase was always filled with legal documents, medical records, and insurance forms, but she also brought small gifts for Emma: flowers, books, and music that might help lift her spirits. The other families in the hospital began to notice Grace's presence. They would see her walking through the corridors with purpose, always carrying her briefcase and wearing her professional business suits. Some of them approached her for advice about their own insurance problems. Grace never turned anyone away. She would spend her lunch breaks helping other families navigate the complex world of medical billing and insurance claims. One afternoon, while Emma was sleeping peacefully after a particularly difficult physical therapy session, Judge Mitchell found himself alone with Grace in the hospital cafeteria. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the vending machines and the distant sound of hospital staff moving through the corridors. Grace sat at a small table near the window, reviewing Emma's latest medical reports while sipping a cup of coffee. She looked tired but determined, and Thomas could see the dedication in her eyes as she worked on his daughter's case. "Grace," he said quietly, approaching her table with his own cup of coffee, "I need to tell you something. I know we met before Emma's accident." Grace looked up from her papers, her expression gentle but unsurprised. She had been waiting for this conversation, knowing that eventually the judge would want to address their previous encounter. She folded her hands on the table and gave him her full attention. "You were in my courtroom yesterday morning," Thomas continued, his voice heavy with guilt. "You had a traffic case, and I didn't treat you fairly. I didn't listen to your evidence. I dismissed your case without giving you a proper hearing." Grace nodded slowly, her face showing no anger or resentment. "I remember, Your Honor," she said simply. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "But you still came to help my family. Why? Why would you help the man who treated you so poorly?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the parking lot below. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, wanting to explain her actions in a way that would help the judge understand. "Judge Mitchell," she said finally, "I've been practicing law for 8 years. In that time, I've faced dismissive judges, skeptical juries, and people who didn't believe I belonged in a courtroom. I've had cases thrown out because of prejudice, and I've watched good people suffer because the system failed them." She paused, taking a sip of her coffee before continuing. "But I learned something important through all of those experiences. We can't control how others treat us, But we can control how we respond. I could have chosen to be bitter and angry, but that wouldn't have helped anyone. Judd Mitchell felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to her words. He had never expected such wisdom and forgiveness from someone he had wronged. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made assumptions based on I don't even know what. Prejudice, I suppose, unconscious bias that I didn't even realize I had." Grace reached across the table and touched his hand gently. "We all have blind spots," she said softly. "The question is what we do when we recognize them. The fact that you're sitting here talking to me about this shows that you're willing to change." That night, Judd Mitchell went home to his quiet house and did something he had never done before. He sat at his computer and researched Grace Walker's career, wanting to understand who she really was beyond their brief encounter in his courtroom. What he found amazed him. Grace was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state, known for taking on difficult cases and fighting for families who couldn't afford justice. She had won landmark cases that had changed laws and protected vulnerable people. Her reputation was built on years of dedicated service to her community. Thomas realized that his unconscious bias had prevented him from seeing Grace's true worth when she appeared in his courtroom. He had dismissed not just her case, but her as a person, without giving her the respect and attention she deserved. It was time to make a change. 3 months after the accident, Emma Mitchell took her first steps without assistance. The physical therapy had been long and painful, but the 17-year-old had shown remarkable determination throughout her recovery. Her parents watched with tears of joy as she walked across the hospital room, her movements still careful but growing stronger each day, thanks largely to Grace's relentless advocacy. The insurance company had covered all of Emma's treatments. The experimental therapies they had initially refused to pay for had proven to be exactly what Emma needed to regain her strength. The family's financial crisis had been completely averted, and Emma was on track to make a full recovery. Margaret hugged Grace tightly on the day Emma was finally discharged from the hospital. "I don't know how we can ever thank you," she said through happy tears. "You saved our daughter's future." Grace smiled warmly, gathering the last of the legal documents from Emma's case. "Seeing Emma walk again is all the thanks I need," she replied. "This is why I became a lawyer in the first place." Judge Mitchell had watched Grace's dedication throughout the entire ordeal. He had seen her work late into the night, fighting for his family with the same passion she had shown in his courtroom months earlier. The difference was that now he recognized her true character and abilities. A week after Emma came home, Judge Mitchell called Grace's office. "Grace, I wonder if you might meet me at the courthouse this evening," he said. "There's something important I need to discuss with you." When Grace arrived at the courthouse that evening, the building was quiet and empty. The security guard let her in through the main entrance, and she walked down the familiar hallway to the courtroom where their story had begun. Judge Mitchell was sitting in the same chair behind the wooden bench, but this time his expression was humble and thoughtful. "Grace," he said as she entered the room, "I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you justice. I was wrong that day when you appeared before me, and I've been wrong in ways I'm only beginning to understand." Grace sat down in the front row of the courtroom, in the same place where she had stood months earlier presenting her traffic case. The setting felt symbolic, as if they were completing a circle that had begun with injustice and was now moving toward redemption. "I've been reviewing my cases from the past few years," Judge Mitchell continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I've realized that I haven't been giving everyone the same careful attention that I should have. I've been making assumptions about people based on how they look, how they speak, or where they come from." Grace listened quietly as he spoke, her expression compassionate but serious. She could see the genuine remorse in his eyes and understood that this was a difficult but necessary conversation for both of them. "I dismissed your case without properly considering your evidence," Thomas admitted. "I made judgments about you as a person before I even heard what you had to say. That's not justice, and it's not the kind of judge I want to be." He stood up and walked round the bench to sit in the galley beside Grace, removing the physical barrier that had separated them during their first encounter. "I want to change," he said earnestly. "I want to be the kind of judge who sees people, the way you saw my family, with compassion and fairness. Will you help me?" Grace was quiet for a moment, considering his request. She had spent years fighting against the kind of bias that Judge Mitchell was now acknowledging. The fact that he was willing to confront his own prejudices and work to change them was both surprising and encouraging. "I think we can work together," she said finally. "But real change requires more than just good intentions. It requires action and ongoing commitment." Over the following year, Grace and Judge Mitchell worked together to transform how justice was served in Millbrook. They established a legal aid clinic at the courthouse, where people who couldn't afford attorneys could get help with their cases. Grace volunteered her time to train other lawyers who wanted to help low-income families navigate the legal system. They also created programs to train judges and court staff about unconscious bias. Grace developed workshops that helped legal professionals recognize their own prejudices and learn strategies for making more fair and impartial decisions. The program was so successful that other courts in the state began adopting similar training. Most importantly, they made sure that every person who entered the courtroom was treated with dignity and respect. Judge Mitchell began taking more time with each case, listening carefully to all evidence and giving defendants a real opportunity to tell their stories. The traffic ticket that had started it all was eventually dismissed. But more importantly, both Grace and Judge Mitchell had learned something valuable about the power of forgiveness and the possibility of change. Their partnership had transformed not just their own lives, but the entire justice system in their community. 1 year later, at the opening ceremony of the new Millbrook Justice Center, Judge Mitchell stood before a crowd of community members. The building had been renovated to include the legal aid clinic, training rooms, and other resources that made justice more accessible to everyone. "Justice isn't just about following the law," he said to the gathered crowd. "It's about seeing the humanity in every person who walks through our doors. It's about giving everyone a fair chance to be heard. And sometimes it's about admitting when we're wrong and working to do better." Grace sat in the front row, smiling proudly. She had taught a judge about justice, and he had learned that true wisdom comes from an open heart. The story of Grace Walker and Judge Mitchell spread throughout their community, inspiring others to look beyond their first impressions and give everyone a chance to show their true character. Sometimes the people we underestimate are exactly the ones who can teach us the most about ourselves.